In AngularJS directives, when we create isolate scopes, we can set up bindings that allow us to pass in outer scope functions, which can then be invoked from within the directive. This feature allows us to attach dynamic functionality to each instance of a directive at the time we create it in the markup. In this video, we will learn how to attach and invoke external scope functions from within our isolate scope directive. So I have a standard setup for Angular with my application module and my controller. In this case, I'm going to use the controller as syntax. And I'm going to create a directive. And this directive will be called test generate numbers. What the directive is going to do is take in a function that will determine how it generates a series of numbers and then return the set of numbers based on the function you send it. It will also take in a function that allows you to determine what happens when you press the save button on the directive's interface. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the methods off of the controller that I'm going to attach to my directives. So the first one is a random number method that returns a list of random numbers based on the count that you send it, or it defaults to 10. So this is going to just return a simple random list array of numbers. The second method is going to do similar, but it's going to send back a sequential list of numbers based on the count you send it, or if you don't send it a count, it will default to 10. And then I'm going to attach two other methods on my controller that I'm also going to attach to my directives or send to my directives. The first one is save first, and whenever that's fired, it just says the first item was saved, is saved in an alert, and similar for the second item. In my directive up here, I'm going to return a directive object, which is simple enough, and then I'm going to create an isolated scope and attach some information to the directive object. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm sending it a template URL called number-gen.html, which is a simple template that just binds to the items, so it'll list the items in the array, and has a save button on it. Secondly, I'm restricting this to an element only, so I can't use it as an attribute. And then third, I'm creating an isolated scope that has a property called generator function, which will bind to an ampersand, which means that I can send it a function and it will work and act as a function. And I can also bind to onSave, which is also going to accept a function binding. And both of those will be available to me on the scope to run as functions. And then finally, I'm also sending in an optional value. This question mark means optional, and all properties in isolated scopes may or may not have these question marks, is a two-way data binding to the count. Okay, now that I have that set up, my last step is to create a controller off of my directive as well. The controller, which is just another property off of my directive object, is a function, constructor function, that takes in a scope, so it's going to be injected with a scope. And since it's the scope that exists up here in lines 8 through 12, I can check to see if the generator function actually was set. So if the generator function is set and it exists, then I'm going to set scope.items to the results of generator function. And I'm just making, here I'm making a call to generator function, which is going to be injected into this directive. And the important thing is when you're making calls, the arguments that you're calling have to be set as a JavaScript object. So in this case, I'm sending in a JavaScript object with the word count, which corresponds to the argument names in my functions that I'm going to attach to. And then similarly, I'm also checking to see whether or not the scope has an onSave. And interestingly, if you notice, I have a scope function on my directive called onSave, but I'm using an underscore to just signify that this is an internal function. And the reason is because I'm going to actually go to my number generator here and I'm going to create an ng-click. And this is kind of a piece of magic in Angular. And I'm going to call the onSave of my directive. And so what's interesting is it'll call this method, and then it will check the scope to see if an external method was attached, and if it was, it's going to actually call the external method. So what this allows me to do is to bind to different method behaviors for different directives, even using the same underlying directive. So we'll see how to do that in a second with the implementation. So now that I have all that set up, my last step is to actually create the user interface. And so the first one is the random numbers, which I'm going to attach right here. And what I'm doing here is using the element test generate numbers. I'm providing it the count, which is 3, and then I'm attaching it to those methods I created previously. On save, it's going to run save first. On generator function is going to use the random number generator. And then similarly, I'm going to do the same thing for the sequential numbers. And I've just changed the onSave to run the save second on my controller and use the sequential number generator. And as you can see, I'm sending it the name of the property I want to send it. And when I run this, as you can see, I have generated 3 random numbers and 3 sequential numbers. So this same directive, which is implemented twice, is using a different random number generator that I'm sending it. And if I hit save, my save button inside my directive is also attached to a different result, or a different method that will fire. So that's how to attach scope functions external to a directive and call them from within the directive.